Do you want to know how to install SQL Server 2019 with Senior Database Administrator best practices?
Yes.
Oh.
Well, I mean, yeah.
In this video, I'm going to install SQL Server 2019 using an easy to follow step-by-step process. If you're new to SQL Server, don't worry. I'm going to hold your hand throughout this entire process.
Yes! 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 Yes!
Whether you're installing SQL Server on a company's production server or you're a true beginner just starting to learn SQL Server, this video is relevant to you. You will not only learn how to install SQL Server, but also understand Senior Database Administration best practices regarding how to configure SQL Server for optimal performance. Whenever you install SQL Server, your goal should be to limit any performance issues that could arise and cause a negative impact on the business.
Guys, fire in the server room, get outside! What the f***? Holy
Of course, due to application programming and expensive queries, performance issues will happen. However, when installing SQL Server, your job is to minimize all potential issues and put the server in the best position possible to handle them without causing any negative impact for front-end users.
And now a word from our sponsor.
Whether your goal is to be a database administrator, database developer, or you just want to learn a new skill,
Damn it!
SQL Server can be a very lucrative career. I personally earn over $200,000 a year with my SQL Server and database skill set. As a freelancer, it's so important to have tools that make your life easier and allow you to focus on your work. If you're like me, everything about invoicing is a hassle. Creating invoices, sending them out, tracking who paid and who didn't, it can be stressful to say the least. This is where our sponsor, Invoice Ninja, can help. They have gorgeous mobile apps. I can make and send out invoices in seconds, track who's viewing them, and of course, get paid for my hard work. As an extremely busy freelancer, Invoice Ninja allows me to focus on the work that I love and makes the invoicing process so much easier. They have a free version and paid versions as well, so head to the first link in the description of this video to find the best solution for you. Thank you so much to Invoice Ninja for supporting the channel and sponsoring this video. Also, if you could take a second and destroy the like button for the YouTube algorithm, I would sincerely appreciate it. It helps my channel out tremendously. So the first step is to download SQL Server 2019. Now in this video, I'm going to be installing SQL Server 2019 Enterprise Edition. However, the installation and setup process is very similar across all editions. The only difference is that you're going to have more features with the Enterprise Edition. If you're a beginner just starting to learn SQL Server, you can actually download a free trial of SQL Server 2019. Make sure you click on the SQL Server 2019 link from Microsoft.com. After you reach the SQL Server 2019 website, click on Try Now. So next you want to click on Download Free Trial. And this is going to give you a 180-day free trial of SQL Server 2019 for Windows. There's also an option for SQL Server 2019 on Azure, which gives you SQL Server 2019 installed on an Azure virtual machine. So I'm going to be installing SQL Server 2019 on premise. However, if you want to start experimenting with Azure, this is a great place to do it. So again, if you're new to SQL Server and you need an installation for it to start learning, go ahead and click on Download Free Trial. When you get to this screen, fill out all the required information and click Submit. And after your installation file has completed downloading, we're ready to move on. Now we need to locate the installation media. You either need to mount the ISO or run the executable. So from here I'm going to mount the ISO file and then run the setup. We're going to select New SQL Server Standalone Installation. If you're using the 180-day evaluation of SQL Server 2019, make sure you select it. And if you have a license for SQL Server 2019, it will either be auto-filled from your ISO file or you will manually enter it here. Then go ahead and click Next. Accept the license terms and then click Next again. So here's where you can have Microsoft Update check for updates for SQL Server. You can see that it's recommended. However, if you're installing SQL Server for a company or organization, they probably have their own patching process. So if you're installing SQL Server for a company, what I recommend doing is checking with the sysadmin to see what the update procedure is. For install rules, you're probably always going to get this warning for Windows Firewall. So if you're installing SQL Server for a company or organization, you may have to go in and allow SQL Server through the Windows Firewall. And what that does is it allows internal client applications to get through the Windows Firewall to connect to your SQL Server instance. So go ahead and click Next. So now we're going to select all the SQL Server features that we want to install. As you can see, there's a lot of features in SQL Server 2019. In this training, we're mainly going to be focused on the core database engine services, so I'm not going to be including features like replication, machine learning services, data quality services. We're going to be leaving those out. But if some of those features are required by your business, make sure you select those here. So we're going to select database engine services, full text, client tools connectivity. Also, when you click on one of the features, if you look to the right, you'll see feature description. This will give you a brief description of each feature. Select integration services so we can use automated SQL jobs. So that's all the features we're going to use for this training. Next, we need to select a location to place our instance root directory. So if you're a beginner to SQL Server, one thing you need to know right now is that you need to keep your database files off the C drive. You need to keep your database files isolated from where the Windows Server OS resides, which in most cases is the C drive. There's many reasons why this is a best practice, such as isolating the I/O for your database files, and most importantly, preventing the C drive from maxing out on space where your Windows Server OS is installed. That can bring your server down to its knees and even crash it.
Oh my god, it's hot!
And one thing I want to give you guys that's included with this training is a document that describes how to split out your drives per Microsoft best practices. This document details out the SQL Server best practice drive layout when you're preparing your storage. It includes an illustration for you which shows the server and then the drives as well. This is the best practice drive layout that I always follow. It's what I recommend to my clients and what I've used as a senior database administrator for some really large organizations. To get this document, which is completely free to you, go down to the description of this video and you'll find a link near the top. This document is included in the training and you can easily download it. So if you're a beginner and you're in the process of learning SQL Server, you may only have the C drive available, so just leave it there if that's the case. However, as a SQL Server database administrator, you need to understand the best practices for drive layouts. So the server I'm using for this training is solely for training purposes and it only has a few drives available to it, so I'm not going to be following the best practice drive layout. However, I do have a couple of additional drives which I'm going to be splitting things out to. So I'm going to place the instance root directory on my D drive. And I'm going to leave the shared feature directory and shared feature directory x86 both on the C drive. Click Next. On this screen, you have the option of using a named instance. If you choose to use a named instance, whenever you connect to your SQL Server instance, it's going to use your server name / instance name. The majority of the SQL Server installations that I've done in my career usually just use the default instance, which is a server name. So I'm going to leave default instance selected and then click Next. Next, we're going to configure the SQL Server service accounts. First, we need to set the SQL Server agent service to start automatically. And you want to do this because you're going to use a SQL Server agent to set up automated jobs like index maintenance, database backups, things like that. The SQL Server browser service is optional. You can leave it disabled, set it to manual or automatic. The SQL Server browser really depends on the requirements of the application that's connecting to the SQL Server instance. Some front-end applications require the SQL Server browser service to be running. So if you don't have any application requirements for the SQL Server browser service, then you can leave it as disabled or set it to manual. I'm going to set it to automatic for this training. Next, we need to select Grant Perform Volume Maintenance Task Privilege to SQL Server Database Engine Service. It's a best practice recommendation to include it, so unless you have some type of requirement from the business to not include it, then I would go ahead and select it. So another best practice recommendation for your SQL Server services is to run them from a domain account that has minimal privileges. This involves creating an Active Directory service account that we will use to run the SQL Server services. If you have the ability to use a SQL Server service account, then for the SQL Server agent, SQL Server database engine, and SQL Server integration services, then for account name, enter your AD service account, and then for password, use its password, and then leave SQL Server full text and SQL Server browser service on the default accounts. If you don't have the ability to use an AD service account, then leave everything under the default accounts and click Next. On server configuration, we're first going to configure the authentication mode. You have the option of using Windows authentication or using mixed mode, which is SQL Server authentication and Windows authentication. To use the SA account and have the ability to create SQL Server accounts, then you need to select mixed mode. So I'm going to select mixed mode because I want to use SQL Server authentication and Windows authentication. And if you select mixed mode, then you need to set a password for the SA account. So I'm going to type in a password for my SA account, and you have the ability here to add SQL Server administrators. Now let me make one thing clear. If you add an account here, it's going to have sysadmin instance level access in SQL Server. If you're not familiar with the sysadmin instance level role, it basically gives them the privileges to do anything on the instance. There needs to be very few accounts that have that access, and it needs to be approved by the business with a specific reason. Typically, the accounts that have sysadmin access in SQL Server are the database administrators. So since I'm a database administrator, I'm going to add myself here. Next, click on the Data Directories tab. When specifying your data directories, use the document that you downloaded earlier. Now for the purpose of this training, I only have a few drives available, so I'm just going to be separating the database files, the backups, and then tempdb. So instead of separating my master data files from my log data files, they're going to be on the same drive. If you can implement the best practice drive layout from the document, then definitely do so. So for this data directories tab, the data root directory is going to be on the D drive and everything else except for the backup directory. The B drive on the server is going to be used to store SQL Server database backups. Next, we'll click on the tempdb tab. The SQL Server setup process has really improved in helping you optimize tempdb. I believe it was SQL Server 2014 that first implemented this tempdb tab. I could be wrong, it could be 2012, but I believe 2014 was the first one that implemented this. In previous versions, after installing SQL Server, then you had to go in and use custom T-SQL scripts to optimize tempdb and move the files around. But now, all of this is included in the setup for you. The SQL Server setup determines how many tempdb data files you need, which is based on how many cores reside in a single NUMA node with a max of 8. So in this case, my server has 8 cores in a single NUMA node, so I'm going to be using 8 tempdb data files. If, for instance, I had a really robust server with say 24 or even 48 cores in a single NUMA node, it would still set the number of files equal to 8 because that's the best practice that Microsoft recommends as the max. The only reason you ever need to extend beyond 8 tempdb data files is if you're experiencing contention. The size of your tempdb drive is really dependent on the databases that are going to reside on your SQL Server instance, the size of them. There's a lot of things that goes into determining how large of a tempdb drive that you need. Typically, on average, for most of the clients that I work with, the tempdb drive ends up being somewhere between 150 gig to 350 gig. And then it's best practice to size your tempdb data files in a way that they will never need to auto-grow. When tempdb files auto-grow, it's a really expensive operation that causes a lot of overhead, and also it can cause the files to grow at different lengths. And when you have different sizes of your tempdb data files, it can basically cause SQL Server to select certain tempdb data files over others instead of evenly dispersing the load. There's a lot of different recommendations from SQL Server professionals on how much of the tempdb drive that you should actually fill up. From what I find, on average, most SQL Server professionals recommend somewhere between 50 to 80% of the drive. So in this case, I have a 100 gig tempdb drive and I'm going to be filling up about 60% of it. I have 8 tempdb files and each one is going to be 7 gig. And this is going to fill up close to 57 gig of the 100 gig drive. I'm going to set the auto growth to 256 meg, and again, hopefully it'll never have to auto grow. When setting auto growth for tempdb files, it's usually best practice to use somewhere between 256 meg to 512 meg. So in this case, I'm going to use 256. Next, I'm going to change the data directory to use my tempdb drive. Again, the only thing that's going to be stored on this T drive is my tempdb files to isolate the I/O. Now for this training, I left the tempdb log file at 8 meg. However, for best practices, and usually what I do on most instances when I configure SQL Server, I usually set this somewhere around 2 gig. You don't want to make the initial size too large because anytime you have to reboot the server, anytime the SQL services get rebooted, it's going to take longer for the instance to come up. You don't want to create the initial log file too large because anytime you have to reboot the server, anytime you restart the SQL Server services, it's going to take longer for the instance to come up. And if you set the initial size to say 2 gig for instance, which is what I usually do, you'll actually get a warning and it will say setup could take longer with a large initial size. So again, for this training, I'm just going to leave it at 8 meg and then I'm going to use the 256 meg auto growth as well here. I'm going to change the log directory to use my tempdb drive, and now I'm going to click on the max stop tab or max degree of parallelism. So this tab is actually completely new to SQL Server 2019. This is the first version that you can actually set the max degree of parallelism in the setup. Every version before 2019, you had to go and set your max stop value after installing SQL Server. So SQL Server 2019 will make a recommendation to you for what it thinks you should use for max stop. On my server, it's recommending that I set max stop equal to 6, which is half of the cores in a single NUMA node. You can see above it says detected logical CPU cores on this computer 12, and then it's recommending my maximum degree of parallelism maxstop is equal to 6. If you're installing SQL Server for a front-end application, then you really need to look through the application requirements. For instance, I used to work with Microsoft Dynamics AX, which is an ERP system developed by Microsoft. For their application, they recommend that you suppress maxstop and set it to 1. You can see below it says to suppress parallel query plan generation, set maxstop equal to 1. So if you set maxstop to 1 and then a query runs that passes your threshold for cost threshold of parallelism, SQL Server will suppress the parallel plan generation and limit the SQL statement to only use one CPU. So unless you have a requirement from the front-end application, then I would use Microsoft's recommendation. So if I use the recommendation of 6 and then I start having a lot of waits for CX packet related to maxstop and it starts causing a lot of CPU contention, then you can modify it down. Maxstop is a setting that you generally have to play around with to find the right value. However, the great thing about it is that you can change it at any time and you don't have to restart any services. So I'm going to leave this option at 6 and now I'm going to click on the memory tab. The memory tab is also something that's brand new to SQL Server 2019. This is another setting that you had to configure after installing SQL Server in all previous versions. You can see the default value is not a great one because it allows SQL Server to use as much memory as possible. If we select the recommended option, what it does is it reserves 4 gig for the OS and any other applications on the server. So my server has 32 gig of total RAM on it, and you can see that my max server memory setting is recommended to be 28 gig. This leaves 4 gig for the OS and any other applications on the server. And if you use the recommended option, which is definitely a best practice, make sure you select the checkbox that says click here to accept the recommended memory configuration for the SQL Server database engine. You have to select that checkbox to use the recommended option. And then don't worry about the file stream tab unless you have an application that requires you to use file stream. So I'm going to go ahead and click next. Now we're ready to install SQL Server 2019. Before you click install, you can go through the summary and see all the settings that you selected. And now I'm going to go ahead and click install. This will take a few minutes to run, so I'm going to go ahead and let it complete and then pick back up on the training. And here we go, you can see that my SQL Server 2019 installation completed successfully. The next thing we need to do is download SQL Server Management Studio, which will allow us to interface with the database engine. Go ahead and click on Install SQL Server Management Tools. Now what this does is it takes you directly to the Microsoft website where you can download SQL Server Management Studio. Alternatively, you can also just open Google and type in SQL Server Management Studio download, and then make sure you click on the Microsoft link for it. And now I'm going to click on this first link to download SSMS 18.5, which is the latest general availability version of SSMS. I'm going to click Save As and place it in a location on my server, and now I'm going to run the setup. I'm going to leave the program files location on the C drive to be placed with all my other x86 applications, and now we're going to click Install. This will also take a few minutes to complete, so I'm going to go ahead and jump to the end of it to pick back up on the training. After the installation for SQL Server Management Studio finishes, then you need to reboot your server to complete the setup. So now I'm going to go ahead and click Restart. So now the server is back up and running, and first what I'm going to do is I'm going to open SQL Server Configuration Manager. SQL Server Configuration Manager is what I recommend you use anytime you want to look at your SQL Server services. So essentially what I'm doing is making sure that all the SQL Server services came back up after the reboot. Now I'm going to click on the Start menu and run SQL Server Management Studio. And now when I click Connect, it's going to authenticate with my Windows account, which I gave sysadmin access back in the setup. And there we go. I'm successfully connected to my SQL Server instance using SQL Server Management Studio. Now I'm going to right click the SQL Server instance and select Properties. And basically what we can do now is go through and check all the configuration settings that we set up during the SQL Server installation. On the Memory tab, you can see the recommended setting that I selected for 28 gig, which reserves 4 gig for the OS and other applications. On processors, you can see that my server has 12 cores in a single NUMA node. And remember, we set my maxstop setting to 6 based on half of this value. On security, you can see that we're using SQL Server and Windows authentication. On database settings, you can see the locations where we chose to place the data, log, and backup files as well. I also recommend that you select Compress Backup. This will utilize compression when taking your SQL Server backups and really cut down on the storage space needed. It has very minimal overhead associated with it, so I definitely recommend that you use it. So on the Advanced tab, one of the options that wasn't in the setup is Cost Threshold for Parallelism. And we want to change the default value for this. The default value of 5 is way too low. With a default value of 5, in any query execution plan where the estimated subtree cost is greater than 5, SQL Server will try to use parallelism. This is a very low value, which can cause a lot of queries to utilize parallelism, in result causing a lot of CPU overhead and high utilization. As a best practice recommendation, I recommend setting it to 30, and then you can modify it up or down based on the queries that are hitting your instance. And you can also see that max DOP is set to 6, which we selected during the setup. And now I'm going to enable another best practice recommendation. I'm going to right click on the SQL Server instance and select facets. Select surface area configuration. And now for remote DAC or dedicated administrator connection, I'm going to set it to true. The remote DAC is a tool for connecting to SQL Server which allows you to execute basic troubleshooting queries in cases of serious performance problems. When serious performance problems arise and prevent you from using SQL Server Management Studio, the remote DAC is essential because it allows you to query and identify the root cause of the performance issues. A few examples of this include when CPU is maxed out on the instance, when you've hit max worker threads, or when you can't remote desktop to the instance. Setting this value to true will enable the remote DAC. And now I'm going to click OK. And the last thing that I recommend you do is create a database where you can store your database administration, store procedures, and other things as well. So on every SQL Server instance that I personally create, I also create a database called DBA admin. And I use this database to hold my store procedures and any logging tables that I create for automated maintenance. So I'm going to name it DBA admin, and then I'm going to set the recovery model to simple because I don't need to be running transaction log backups for this database. And now I'm going to click OK. And here's an example of what the DBA admin database looks like with my store procedures expanded. I use a lot of Brent Ozar store procedures for troubleshooting, and then I'll also create some other store procedures that I use for maintenance. Another thing that I want to mention is that this SQL Server installation is a part of a course that I'm creating on Teachable for SQL Server Database Administration for Beginners. It's going to be a really in-depth course with a lot of training that I wish someone would have taught me as a beginner. As soon as the course is finished and it's live on Teachable, I'll throw a link in the description of this video for everyone that's interested. Also be sure to follow me on Instagram, Twitter, and Facebook because I'll be announcing the course there when it's live as well. I want to again thank invoiceninja.com for supporting today's video. If you're like me, you really don't like the paperwork. I'd much rather be working on my craft and making money. So if you prefer to focus on your passion and not waste a lot of time on the administration stuff, check out Invoice Ninja by clicking on the first link in the description of this video. SQL Server or any database management system is a lifetime skill. You will never learn everything from one course, and that's one of the most compelling aspects of the skill for me. I love to be challenged and constantly learn new things. I still learn new things in SQL Server every single week. It's really easy to get overwhelmed and try to learn 20 things at the same time. Be patient, focus on a specific aspect of SQL Server, learn it well, and then move on to a different topic. Being laser focused on a single area will allow you to learn so much faster and retain it. Patience, hard work, and consistency all combined together is going to make you a lot of money long term. So start today and let's get to work. On this end screen, I recommend checking out these videos and be sure to hit that round subscribe button for weekly tech videos and hit that notification bell so you don't miss anything. Thank you for watching, and until next time.
Yeah, jungle in the juice, man. I can feel the heat, yeah, I can feel the heat.